Hello, everyone. Welcome to Philosopher Meets Critics. This event is hosted by the University of Cologne and the Federal University of Bahia in Brazil. My name is Paul Silva. I'll be hosting today's event. I'm a junior professor here at the University of Cologne. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to introduce you all to today's author, his book, and his critics. Brian Talbot is our author. His book is titled The End of Epistemology as We Know It, published with Oxford University Press in 2024. Brian is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Colorado at Boulder. He has a PhD from the University of Southern California in philosophy, and he has a JD from Berkeley. Brian is the author of a wide range of articles in epistemology and ethics as well. Genae Matthews is our first commentator. Genae is a PhD candidate at UNC Chapel Hill. Genae is the author of Fit-Related Reasons to Inquire, forthcoming in the Australasian Journal of Philosophy. Genae's primary research interests are in epistemology and social and feminist philosophy. Genae is a graduate fellow with the Applied Epistemology Project at UNC, as well as a graduate fellow with the Parr Center for Ethics. Dan Singer is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania with a secondary appointment at the Wharton School of Business. Dan took his PhD from the University of Michigan and is the author of Right Belief and True Belief with Oxford University Press that appeared last year. He's also the author of a number of articles in epistemology. And Jeff Dunn is our final commentator. Jeff is the director of the Janet Prindle Institute for Ethics at DePauw University. He's also an associate professor in the DePauw Philosophy Department. He took his PhD from UMass Amherst. He's the author of many papers in leading journals in epistemology with an emphasis on reliabilism and epistemic consequentialism. One of his papers that I quite enjoyed reading recently was titled A Solution and a Problem for Veritism, published in Philosophical Studies. So those are our critics. Brian is again our author. And with that, Brian will kick us off with a summary of his book. Brian, please take us away.
Great, and I'm going to screen share my slides. I think we should be good there. All right. I want to start by thanking the organizers. I'm really happy to be able to do this, and I want to thank my commentators for putting the time into working through the book. There's a lot going on in that book, and they're really insightful and challenging and helpful comments. And then for anybody watching this, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. The name of the book is The End of Epistemology as We Know It, and that's also a statement of purpose. My goal in the book is to argue for the end of epistemology as we know it, not because I'm against epistemology or dislike epistemology or I'm opposed to epistemology, actually, but on the contrary, because I think epistemology is really important, like it's really, really deeply important subject matter. And I think a lot of contemporary work in epistemology sells epistemology short. Is that it's focused on the wrong stuff. It's focused on stuff that doesn't matter enough and that we can do a lot better. So my slide should advance there. All right, there we go. So the main thesis of the book is the standard epistemic norms, the ones that we kind of focus on in mainstream analytic epistemology don't matter or don't matter enough. And that we can do better. There are better epistemic norms they're significantly different that should replace the standard epistemic norms. So if we think epistemology is important, we ought to do epistemology quite differently. That's the sort of main thesis of the book. So sure, see where I'm coming from, what motivated me, what got me started on this. Imagine you're a normative epistemologist and you work in normative epistemology and you're trying to explain to somebody what you do who's not really familiar with the field. And so you say, oh, I'm a normative epistemologist. And they say, oh, what does that mean? You say, well, I work on epistemic norms. They say, well, what are epistemic norms? You say, oh, well, you give an answer along these lines. They're about what we should believe, or maybe they're about right belief, or maybe they're about rationality or reasonable belief or justification of belief. And you can say all the same thing about credences. And everything I say in the book applies both to views about norms on belief and norms on credences. So you say, this is what I work on and what we should. So your interlocutor says, oh, what do you think the epistemic norms actually are? And if you do anything like standard analytic epistemology, you're going to give an answer along these lines. The norms are about truth or accuracy, They're about fit to evidence. They're about reliable belief formation, or beliefs being coherent, something along those lines. So I call those the standard epistemic norms. And really, my intention in the book is to basically argue with more or less everybody. And so probably if you're doing mainstream epistemology right now, I'm probably trying to argue with you. And so you were probably working on standard epistemic norms. So you give an answer, you say, I work on standard epistemic norms, I'm interested in truth or accuracy, fit to evidence, etc. So your interlocutor says, okay, do you think that matters? Do you think that stuff's important? Now, of course, one thing you could say is, no, I don't think it's important at all. It's just a thing I work on. And if that's your answer, you don't think these norms are important or supposed to be important, I guess my book's not going to be terribly interesting to you. But I think most of us got excited about epistemology because we do think epistemology is important, and we do think the epistemic norms matter. So let's imagine you say, yes, I think the epistemic norms matter. So here, I think a sophisticated interlocutor is going to pause and say, huh, so the norms about truth or fit to evidence or reliability or coherence. So they're going to say, what if I have a belief about, just to pick some standard examples, the number of blades of grass on the lawn, or the number of specks of dust on my desk, or how often people walk down a totally random street on a totally random city at a totally random hour, or I take some fact and I just disjoin it with some other random proposition. I can have beliefs about all of those things, and those beliefs can be true. They can be reliably formed. They can fit my evidence. They can be coherent. But those beliefs seem totally pointless. In fact, arguably most facts are about kind of relatively uninteresting trivia. You can generate infinite pointless facts by doing kind of the logical entailments from other pointless facts. And so almost everything we could possibly have a belief about, it seems just kind of pointless trivia. But all those beliefs about pointless trivia, they can be true and reliably formed and accurate and fit our evidence, so on and so forth. So the things that norms are supposed to be about are features shared, but largely by stuff that seems totally pointless. And so the interlocutor might say, do the norms matter when they govern these kind of pointless beliefs or these pointless credences? And then one thing you might say, yeah, they're pretty important, even when they govern these pointless beliefs. But that's a really surprising claim. If that's the claim that you make, that the norms do matter really significantly when they govern even the most pointless trivia, you have to explain. You got to back that up. You'd have to have some argument about, well, this is why it is they matter, because it's certainly not obvious they do. So that's one way you could go. Another way you could go is say, no, the norms don't really matter. Maybe they matter a tiny little bit for these pointless beliefs, but not really. But then your interlocutor is going to say, okay, but if they don't really matter very much when they govern these pointless beliefs, and almost everything we could believe is pointless, and the features that you talk about, the norms talk about, are shared, are features of pointless beliefs as well as non-pointless beliefs. So why do the norms ever matter if they're about the stuff that is mostly unimportant, right? And so if you think the norms do matter, you have to answer that question. You have to have an explanation for why the norms ever matter significantly, given that most of what the norms are about seems relatively pointless. So that's first a puzzle about the standard epistemic norms that really worries me. But of course, if you're, the person you're talking to is going to admit that not all beliefs are pointless. A lot of times we do care about what we believe. It does matter what we believe, but often that's because it's useful. So I call this class of beliefs mundane beliefs, and mundane beliefs aren't pointless, but they seem important just because they're useful. And your interlocutor is going to say, right, so yeah, I can see why we want to, we care about what our mundane beliefs are. We want to do a good job there, but you're talking about evidence and reliability and coherence and stuff like that. These are all these kind of truth-oriented notions, but sometimes false beliefs can be useful, potentially as useful as true beliefs. So just to kind of give a toy example, I have a belief about where my car keys are, and that's a mundane belief. I only care about that because I eventually want to be able to find my car keys so I can drive. So let's say I have, a somewhat false belief about where my car keys are. It's a little bit off, maybe it's a few inches off or a foot off, or something like that. So it's a false belief, strictly speaking, but it's close enough to the truth to be just as useful, right? So why does it matter that my belief is false rather than true? if what I care about is usefulness of my beliefs, or what I care about mundane beliefs is because they're useful, why are the norms so fixated on these truth-defined notions like evidence, which is evidence of truth, or reliability, which is reliable truth production or coherence? Why are the norms so fixated just on the truth when false beliefs can be useful sometimes, and a lot of why we seem to care about our beliefs is because they're useful? So that's another puzzling feature of the standard epistemic norms. If you want to claim that these norms really do matter, you have to explain why norms that are so truth-oriented should be the norms that matter, given that our interest is not always purely in the truth when we form beliefs. But of course, I think if your interlocutor is, thoughtful, they're going to say, I admit that not all the beliefs we care about are just useful. Sometimes we do care about beliefs for their own sake, or something like roughly speaking the truth for its own sake. So let's concede that. But still, there's an even further puzzle. We do care about the truth for its own sake sometimes, but sometimes it does seem like having some false beliefs can be helpful in the pursuit of the truth. So this is something that's often called epistemic trade-offs. Sometimes forming one bad belief, a false belief, a belief that's against your evidence, incoherent, so on and so forth, that can have significant downstream epistemic benefits. So it may be that forming false beliefs in the short run can benefit your research in the long run. For example, there's some empirical research that is suggestive that having an overconfident view of your own abilities as a researcher actually can be beneficial for making discoveries. So that's maybe a possible epistemic trade-off. So if we do care about the truth, when we're interested in the truth, shouldn't we make trade-offs sometimes? But if you think the standard epistemic norms are about evidence and reliability and coherence, is there room in there for reasons to make trade-offs as being part of what makes beliefs rational and justified? And in standard analytic epistemology, the answer is no. The norms either absolutely prohibit trade-offs no matter what, or they just ignore trade-offs. They don't take trade-offs as reason giving at all. They're sort of outside the epistemic norms. And again, that's really weird, right? If you think the norms matter and you're interested in something like the truth or something like that, why would you have norms that either absolutely prohibit the effective pursuit of truth or just ignore the effective pursuit of truth? That's really strange. So we have this question, why should standard epistemic norms matter when, again, they're about features like truth, accuracy, reliability that are shared just equally by pointless and non-pointless beliefs? They're very truth-oriented, even though false beliefs can be useful, and they prohibit or ignore trade-offs. So that we have these really puzzling features of the epistemic norms as standardly conceived. Now, that's not to say the epistemic norms don't matter, but certainly it's surprising that they do. And so if you think the standard epistemic norms matter, you need to give what I call a vindication. You need an account of why they matter. You can't just assert that they do. You can't say it's a brute fact because it's such a surprising fact. Instead, it demands an explanation. So that's sort of the starting point for my project in the book. And so what I do in the book is I consider a bunch of plausible vindications of epistemic norms, plausible accounts of why the epistemic norms matter. And what I argue is that on each such vindication, the norms that actually matter are non-standard norms. They don't have these puzzling features. So let me, before I get into that more, and that's going to come up, that's really going to be the focus of the comments. I should say something about how I think about what it is to matter. So this is a thing that we do talk about in philosophy, but we don't always have the same terms for it. It's not something that there's a kind of well-established vocabulary for this. So it's pretty familiar. So we're very familiar with norms that don't matter. So the example I use in the book, and I think it's a good example, there are all these games that are really kind of boring, silly games that we play with children to pass the time until they're able to play actually interesting games. So like tic-tac-toe, there's this game Shoots and Ladders. I think it's called Snakes and Ladders in other countries. Candyland. These are kids' games that have no strategy. There's no value to them whatsoever. So then these games have rules. These rules are norms that can be conformed to or violated. You might find yourself playing one of these pointless, silly games with another adult. Neither of you might want to play the game. There might be nothing at stake. There's no, you're not betting on it, whatever. None of you care about it, but you're still playing the game and therefore subject to its norms. And it might turn out that you break one of the rules of this game for no reason whatsoever. And the person you're playing with might say, oh, you broke the rule. And perfectly appropriate for you to say, true, so what? Big deal. You sort of shrug off the violation of the norm, even though the violation is completely gratuitous. You've no reason to violate the norm whatsoever, but you say, so what? So these norms don't matter at all, but this illustrate a kind of a general thought. The less a norm matters, the sort of more appropriate is a kind of shrug off gratuitous norm violations. Just say, so what, right? So it's more appropriate to say, so what, the less a norm matters. So that's the first point. The second point about mattering is we often see norms come into conflict, and there's gonna be cases where you can satisfy one norm or another, but not both. And in those cases, you ought to follow the norm that matters more. So, I think etiquette can sometimes matter. It's important not to be rude to some extent. Morality obviously matters quite a bit. You might have some etiquette norm come into conflict with some moral norm. So let's say in order to save someone's life, you need to be rude to somebody else. And so even though the etiquette norm might matter somewhat, the moral norm matters much more. And so you ought to save a life. And so that's the thought. So given these thoughts, if the standard epistemic norms don't matter at all or barely matter, don't matter significantly, then basically you can always shrug off violations of the standard norms and say, so what? And so that would be problematic. And even if the standard epistemic norms do matter somewhat, if they get partly vindicated, if there are alternative non-standard norms that matter more, then by definition, whenever these norms conflict, you ought to follow the non-standard norms, right? So again, if there are these non-standard norms that matter more, they should replace the standard norms in the sense that you should always follow the non-standard norms whenever they disagree. So I won't get too much into this because this is going to come up in some of the comments. But in the book, I consider a bunch of possible vindications of the norms. Some are along consequentialist lines. Roughly conform the norm promotes epistemic goods, and that's why the norms matter. A more deontological view, conforming to the norms respects the good, and that's why the norms matter. I consider the possibility that epistemic norms matter because they play an important role in norms and action, and then also sort of a social account that the epistemic norms have important social benefits, coordinating inquiry or identifying source of information, and that's why they matter. And basically on each of these views, I say, enough, even on that vindication, if you take the deontological or consequentialist or action vindication, whatever, there are better non-standard norms that should replace the standard norms. These non-standard norms are going to require making trade-offs sometimes. And also, they're going to be laxer than the standard norms in some ways. Sometimes they're going to allow us to ignore evidence or be incoherent for no good reason whatsoever. And then exactly how this plays out varies depending on what vindication you end up preferring. But you get something like these thematic results in every chapter of the book. So if you think epistemology is important, the idea is you have to give up the standard epistemic norms. We have to give up epistemology as we currently know it. If you think epistemology should be important, we should be exploring these non-standard norms. Thank you.
Brian, thank you so much for the summary. Genae, please take it away.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you also to Paul and to Concept for hosting this event, and again to Brian for providing such an engaging and rich book for discussion. In what follows, I'm going to provide a brief overview of Brian's project as I understand it, and then I'm going to raise 3 comments. Since both Brian himself and the other commentators will do the former, I'll keep that part brief. So in the end of epistemology as we know it, Brian argues that any plausible explanation of why the epistemic norms matter won't vindicate the standard epistemic norms. To do this, he canvasses, by my count at least, 4 such candidate explanations and shows that for each one of them, the norms they vindicate have to require trade-offs. Since the standard epistemic norms don't permit trade-offs, it follows that none of these candidate explanations vindicate the standard epistemic norms. Of course, this really simplistic reconstruction misses lots of Brian's subtler argumentative moves, some of which the other commentators will helpfully touch on. I've just reconstructed his central line of argument in this way, both because trade-offs play such a crucial role and its rejection of the standard epistemic norms, and because they're the focus of the first of my two comments today. Prior to getting to those comments, though, I first wanted to say a bit about what I really liked about the book. The End of Epistemology as we know it urges us to think carefully about why epistemic norms matter. While this kind of scrutiny is obviously commonplace within other philosophical domains like metaethics, it is, I think, not as common in epistemology, and it's something that's easily forgotten when we're in the weeds of defending some particular first-order norm or other. I'm grateful to Brian for centering this question, even though, as we'll see, I ultimately disagree with his answer to it. In addition, Brian also helpfully prompts us to think about how we taxonomize belief by distinguishing, on the one hand, beliefs that are interesting, mundane, and pointless, and on the other hand, between beliefs that are true or accurate and beliefs that are good enough. Both of these families of distinction are ones to which our theorizing should be sensitive, and Brian has thereby done us a service by drawing our attention to them and demonstrating how the norms that bear on them may both be different and have different sources of vindication. Lastly, the book is clear, engaging, and really easy to follow. I genuinely enjoyed reading every page of it. Okay, on to the comments. My first comment, which really has two parts, concerns trade-offs. The first part of this comment is really an invitation for Brian to say more about how we are to think about trade-offs once we reject the standard epistemic norms. So hold on one second. I have a cat and she's being a little bit rambunctious. Maybe she loves the standard epistemic norms and is not a fan of what's happening. Okay. Throughout the book, the classic example of a trade-off is one in which you form a suboptimal belief now in order to be able to form several more optimal beliefs later. However, Brian often construes optimality in terms of truth. You form one false but perhaps good enough belief now to be able to form many true, or at least closer to true, beliefs down the line. This made me confused about how we're supposed to think about trade-offs once we reject that truth or accuracy is the only epistemic good. If we accept that beliefs that are false but close to the truth really are good enough, then it seems like there's no trade-off in forming one false but close enough belief in order to form many beliefs down the line. That is, if forming false but close enough beliefs isn't ultimately bad, then forming one to get something down the line isn't to perform a trade-off, because performing a trade-off necessarily involves doing something suboptimal in a way that's actually costly in order to get something optimal. And if we accept the non-standard epistemic norms, then false but close enough beliefs aren't actually suboptimal in a way that's actually costly. So another way to state this confusion is that it's hard for me to make sense of Brian's claim that the non-standard epistemic norms require trade-offs. If we accept those norms, then the suboptimal thing we are supposedly taking on when performing the trade-off, that is, this false but good enough belief, is no longer suboptimal, or no longer suboptimal in a way that matters. But if this is the case, then taking on that thing is no longer performing the trade-off. So it seems to me that it's not that the non-standard norms license or require trade-offs, but that if we accept them, then what were previously trade-offs become not trade-offs at all. This, I think, would be a somewhat strange result dialectically for Brian, because he's adamant that the vindicated epistemic norms must require trade-offs, but it also seems like what we must say if we accept the non-standard epistemic norms. Okay. The second part of my comment about trade-offs concerns whether the fact that the standard epistemic norms forbid trade-offs really generates the explanatory burden that Brian takes it to. In Chapter 1, he argues that the fact that the standard epistemic norms forbid trade-offs entails that we must explain why those norms matter. He, for the most part, seems to assume that making epistemic trade-offs is obviously good, and from this he constructs the conditional that if the standard epistemic norms prohibit something obviously good, then we have to explain why those norms matter. However, the truth of this conditional is far from obvious to me. Here's why. Accept that epistemic trade-offs are good in some sense. Now consider the standard epistemic norms. I take it that those norms are norms of epistemic rationality. The question then becomes, even if epistemic trade-offs are good in some sense, are they good from the perspective of epistemic rationality? My view is that if the answer is no, then it's not a problem that the standard epistemic norms, as norms of epistemic rationality, don't permit them, and so it's not something we have to explain away. However, I take it that in contrast, Brian would say that if the answer is no here, then so much the worse for epistemic rationality. Let's table for the moment why I don't think that's the right response. Right now, I just want to emphasize why I don't think it's at the very least the obvious response. To see why, first note that some philosophers think that epistemic rationality is concerned roughly with fit between our attitudes and with the world. If that's what we're concerned with, then trade-offs aren't good from the perspective of epistemic rationality. Rather, they're bad because it's bad from the perspective of epistemic rationality as concerned with fit to form a belief that doesn't fit the evidence, no matter how valuable the outcomes one might accrue by doing so. That is, when we construe epistemic rationality in this manner, it's not rational to form a belief that the evidence doesn't support, for the reason that doing so would allow you to form more evidentially supported beliefs down the line. My point is that we can accept this picture of epistemic rationality and accept that sometimes trade-offs are good for other reasons. It's just that on this picture, trade-offs won't be good from the perspective of epistemic rationality, and so are not the kind of thing that should be vindicated by the standard epistemic norms. Rather, trade-offs should be a site at which the norms that vindicate them, whatever norms those are, and the norms of epistemic rationality clash. The view, stated in other words, would be that trade-offs are good sometimes, and that there are other norms, that is, norms not about epistemic rationality, that permit them, but they aren't good from the perspective of epistemic rationality, and so when confronted with one, we're thereby confronted with the competing demands of the norms that permit them and the norms of epistemic rationality. The natural response for Brian here, I take it, would be to say something like, okay, so trade-offs matter, but not from the perspective of epistemic rationality construed as concerned with fit. But then why does epistemic rationality construed in this way matter? This brings me to my second comment, which is about Brian's view about what matters. Okay, so I interpret Brian as providing a value-based account of what matters. This is because he argues for a picture on which the norms governing mundane beliefs matter because they promote good epistemic outcomes, and the norms governing interesting beliefs matter because they promote respect. It's hard to interpret this as anything other than a view on which both sets of norms matter because they promote some kind of value. And so it's hard to interpret Brian's view about what matters as anything other than value-based. I'm not convinced that we ought to accept this picture. After all, there are competing candidates for what matters. Arguably, it matters that we have fitting responses to things. It matters that I admire the admirable and despise the despicable, rather than admire the despicable and despise the admirable. Similarly, it arguably matters for me to do what I have reason to do, more generally speaking. It matters that I value what I have reason to value, whether or not that thing is in fact valuable in a more objective sense, and it matters that I act on the basis of what I have reason to do. You might think that those of us who think that fitting responses and reasoned responsiveness more generally matter have to explain why those things matter, but I don't think that we have this burden any more so than those who think that value matters. Our explanatory burdens regarding why it matters that I admire the admirable don't strike me as any greater than the explanatory burden regarding why it matters that I promote some sort of value. Moreover, if we recognize that there are things that matter other than value, then Brian's conclusion doesn't go through it as easily. If it matters that we have fitting responses to things, and in particular that what we believe fits our evidence, then it will be the standard epistemic norms, and not the non-standard epistemic norms, that capture what matters. What I think this shows us, at a minimum, is that even if we accept that epistemic trade-offs matter, we have to accept that there are ways of construing what it is to matter that don't bottom out in value promotion. And once we do that, it's not so obvious that the standard epistemic norms wholly fail to capture what matters, and the non-standard epistemic norms wholly succeed in doing so. Rather, if we think that something like fitting responses also matters, then at the very least there will be a choice point. We'll have to decide which of the two things matters for a theory of epistemic rationality to capture. We'll have to decide which of these two things matters is the kind of thing that ought to be vindicated by our epistemic norms. I think that the epistemic norms ought to capture fitting responses and not trade-offs, but I'm not going to argue for that here. My point is really only to show that Brian's conclusion might not be as quickly drawn as I take him to want it to be. Okay. My last comment is again an invitation for Brian to say more, this time about whether he takes the norms at issue to be characteristic of the ideal epistemic agent or action guiding for the non-ideal epistemic agent. On the one hand, there's good reason to infer that he thinks of them as the former. After all, the norms to which he objects are norms which are constitutive of a theory of epistemic rationality, and we might think that those norms are supposed to be such that following them perfectly would make us ideally epistemically rational. In other words, we might think that they're norms that govern the ideally rational epistemic agent, and to which we have to try our best to follow, even though we will, perhaps necessarily, do so fallibly. On the other hand, I think there's a lot of textual evidence that it's the latter. After all, one of Brian's central objections to the standard epistemic norms is that they prohibit beliefs that are false but good enough from being normatively vindicated. And this is an issue that matters for us, that is, as non-ideal epistemic agents who often use such beliefs to successfully get around in the world and to form other better beliefs. It's not an issue that would matter to the ideal rational agent, who by stipulation wouldn't ever form such beliefs, or need to. This leads me to my last question, which is, why can't we have both? Why can't we retain the standard epistemic norms as norms constitutive of a theory of rationality, construed as a theory that tells us what it is to be ideally epistemically rational, while introducing some non-standard epistemic norms as action guiding principles? In other words, why can't we say that the standard epistemic norms show us how the ideally rational epistemic agent would act, and therein perhaps give us a model, while the non-standard epistemic norms constrain our actions as non-ideal epistemic agents? This move is intimately familiar from political philosophy. There we often have pictures of what an ideally just state would look like, along with norms that tell us how to go on given our imperfect and deeply unjust circumstances. So the question, I guess, is just, why not a similar move for epistemology? I'm curious to see what Brian has to say about this, and I'm going to close here. Thanks again to Brian for writing such a stimulating book, and to the other commentators for asking what I know will be such interesting questions about it. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you so much, Genae. Brian, please take it away.
Thanks. Those are great comments, and I'm not going to be able to well, hold on. Let me start my slides. I'm not going to be able to fully and completely address everything in there. But I will partly and incompletely address some of what's in there. So let me share my slides again. Oh, dear Zoom. There we go. Cool. So, a brief comment on the trade-off stuff. So I'm thinking of trade-offs as forming not just suboptimal beliefs, potentially really bad beliefs, so blatantly false beliefs that aren't good enough at all, that would be ordinarily irrational, unjustified, impermissible, even by non-standard norms, that can be made permissible by significant enough benefits. So that's how I'm thinking about trade-offs. It doesn't have to just involve suboptimality. It can involve like really pretty blatant badness if that was beneficial enough. So that's a brief comment. I think the more challenging stuff, I'm going to start with the final set of comments about ideal agents. Are the standard epistemic norms just for ideal agents? I don't intend for them. I don't think that's the case. So I'll say a bit about how I think about ideal and non-ideal agents and norms. So the arguments I give, for example, about lax norms are different than kind of standard arguments for satisficing norms or for lax norms in the literature. So often people say, if you're cognitively deficient in various ways, if you're cognitively limited like we are, it's best not to strive for perfection. You'll do better in the long run striving, being okay with some imperfection. And so that's a kind of argument for sort of short-term satisficing, because that's a long-run best way to produce good outcomes for sort of long-run maximization. But that's not how I'm thinking of it. I think the epistemic norms should be lax just because more stringent norms don't matter as much as laxer norms. And so it's permissible to obey lax norms for literally no reason whatsoever, completely gratuitously. So even if you have no cognitive limitations whatsoever, and there's no reason for you to form a suboptimal belief, it is permissible for you to form a suboptimal belief, as I'm thinking of it, just because those norms are better. They're better not because they promote the good more in the long run. They're better because they're, roughly speaking, more in line with what matters. Exactly why suboptimality is permissible. It gets a different argument in each chapter, kind of depending on what you think the ultimate vindication of the norms are. So I can't say too much more about that. So I'm thinking even ideal agents are governed by these laxer norms, because not because the laxness of the norms have nothing to do with our imperfections. They have to do with the fact that stringent norms don't matter as much. So that's the first point. And then also, even ideal agents can benefit from trade-offs sometimes. So trade-offs are something that's relevant to both ideal and non-ideal agents. So just to illustrate that, imagine I've got some really interesting secret that, of course, everybody in the world wants to know. Even the ideal agent wants to know it. They don't know it because ideal cognitive agents aren't omniscient. They're just fully maximally rational and have no cognitive limitations. So the ideal agent really wants to know my secret. And I offer them a deal. I say, if you form a false belief against your evidence about whatever, about one thing, I'll tell you my secret, right? So that's a case in which they can make an epistemic trade-off and benefit from it. And so the norms that govern even the ideal agents have to speak to those trade-offs. These are not just for limited agents like us, although it tends to be the case that we can benefit more from a wider range of trade-offs than the ideal agent. But this gets to my third point, which is, this is a terrible slide. This is way too much for one line. But basically, as I think of the norms, fundamentally, there's no distinction between ideal and non-ideal norms, norms for non-ideal and ideal agents. So if you think about the norms in terms of value promotion, as the consequentialist does, or in terms of respect, as the deontologist does, ultimately, fundamentally, the norms have the same source. For the consequentialist, it's roughly something like the norm promote the good. For the deontologist, it's something like respect what matters, something like that. And those are fundamentally the same for both the ideal and non-ideal agent. But of course, they play out in particular cases differently for ideal and non-ideal agents because we have different capacities. So the things that an ideal agent can do to promote the good are different than the things that a non-ideal agent can do to promote the good. Beliefs that would disrespect what matters for an ideal agent won't be disrespectful for non-ideal agent for various reasons. And so the same fundamental norms apply to everybody, but they play out differently in particular cases for ideal and non-ideal agents, given their different capacities. But because of that, even if one thought the standard norms were the norms that governed particular ideal agents in particular cases, which I don't think they are, but even if they were, they just wouldn't apply to us. So the distinctively ideal norms literally don't govern us at all. So it's more often thought that, oh, well, we are governed by the ideal norms, we can't live up to them, so we have to also kind of be governed by second best norms, but that's not how I'm thinking of it. Because we are fundamentally governed by the same norms as ideal agents, because of our limitations, we have different option sets, and those option sets get evaluated differently. So the particular obligations that ideal agents are under because of their capacities we are not subject to. And so if the standard norms apply to ideal agents because of their capacities, they just don't apply to us at all, is kind of how I'm thinking of it. Okay, so I'm gonna go backwards because I put these in a weird order. Whoops. All right, so no, sorry, I apologize. You'll get to that eventually. All right, so part of the question that Genae poses is, I'm really thinking about norms quite often in terms of value. Why think about it that way? So why not think about it, for example, in terms of fit? So I'll talk about fit in a second, but why am I so interested in epistemic value? Well, there is epistemic value. It's very hard to deny that. This is like the cornerstone. This is like a truism in so much epistemology. So if there is epistemic value and it is sometimes important to us, then we can either say the epistemic norms have nothing to do with value or they have something to do with value. If they have something to do with value, the arguments in the book kind of all go forward. If the norms have nothing to do with value, that's really sort of surprising. Why would those norms matter? Given that there's epistemic value, that sometimes it matters, why would epistemic norms have nothing to do with that value? So that would be sort of a surprising upshot that would demand an explanation. So of course, you might give an explanation in terms of fittingness. You might say, the epistemic norms are about some kind of fittingness, fit to evidence or fitting belief, something like that. Fittingness clearly matters, you might say. And so we can give this non-value oriented explanation for why the epistemic norms matter. But I think that is going to run into the exact same problems I talk about throughout the book. So imagine you have a colleague who works on fitting, is trying to develop a theory of the fittingness of familial love, right? And so they get really excited. They run down the hall to you and they pound on your door, say, they did it. They say, I figured out how fitting familial love works. And they explain their view to you. And in the course of this, it turns out they think it is perfectly fitting to love your children so much it's suffocating to them, that your love for your children crushes them under its burdens. And they think, yeah, that's perfectly fitting familial love. And they say it's fitting to love one child so much that it harms all your other children. That's totally fitting familial love. And this is their account. They worked it out. So what should you say about this account of familial love? Well, there's a few things you might say. One is, oh, well, I guess fitting love's not that important because that's pretty terrible. That's not important. Or you might say, well, fitting love is important. We talk about fittingness because we care about it. So that can't be what's fitting because that's really pretty awful. That's not important. Or you might say, well, okay, let's accept that is what's fitting. There's something important about fitting. Clearly, that's not the full story about how we should love other people, because that can't be the full story. We need to say a lot more. So maybe there's some role in our account of normativity for fitting love, but it's not a complete story. We need to say a lot more. Now, notice you would say all of these things as a person who thought they cared about love. If you care about familial love as you understand it, these are exactly what you're going to say. You're going to say, oh, that can't be what love is, or I guess I didn't really care about love in the first place. I cared about something else, or we need we need to say more, right? And so if our theory of fitting X is sufficiently divorced from what seems important, then either we should reject it as a theory of fittingness, or we should reject fittingness or fit as important, or fittingness can't be the whole normative story. But then, of course, that's just what I would say about the standard epistemic norms. If the standard epistemic norms are supposed to be an account of fitting belief or something fitting, well, they look really bad. They look really deficient in so many ways. So either we should say, I guess fitting belief's not important, or fitting belief is important, so that can't be what fitting belief is. Or we should say, I guess if that is what fitting belief is, that's not the full story about the norms of belief, because we need to say a lot more because of how deficient these fittingness is, for all the reasons I kind of sketched very briefly at the beginning of the talk. So I do think you can try to reconcile. You can talk about fittingness as an account of why the norms matter, but it's either incomplete or unsatisfying, basically. And so I don't think this is going to give us a vindication of the standard epistemic norms. Thank you. I think that's all I had to say about. I'm just looking at my notes to make sure I hit every topic I want to hit. I think that's good. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Well, we'll take an irregularly scheduled non-commercial break, and we'll be right back. Welcome back from our non-commercial break. Dan, please take us away.
Great. Yeah. So Brian, thanks for this book. It was fun to read. Most importantly, I think it needs to be very widely recognized that this is the best title of a philosophy book that's ever been written. For many years, I believed it was Larry Sklar's Space, Time, and Space-Time. But I think you've taken the crown there. It has many levels. So well done there in particular. Okay, so it's standard, right? If you're giving comments, you're supposed to recap it, but obviously this is a little bit of a different context. So I think maybe what I'll do is I'll remind listeners about listeners about the main claim here. So the main claim is that the standard epistemic norms that have been traditionally endorsed by philosophers, those that emphasize truth and coherence and evidence and reliability and rationality, like we were just talking about, are wrong, and those should be replaced by the non-standard set of epistemic norms that Brian tells us about at the end of the book. And the methodology, as Brian told us at the beginning of this discussion, is he says, take whatever explanation you've got for why epistemic norms matter, and he calls that a vindication. And then Brian says, for each vindication, he's going to show that some non-standard set of norms matter more by that vindication's lights than the standard epistemic norms. And the idea is supposed to be, if all the vindications have that conclusion, then we should give up on the whatever you think is the vindication for standard epistemic norms, you're going to want to give up on it. Okay, so Brian got us that far. I want to dig just a little bit deeper into some of the vindications that Brian gives us. So just to make sure all the watchers are on board, there's 4 main ones, as Genae said. That's how many I counted too, Genae. So there's a consequentialist vindication, and the idea of the consequentialist vindication is that epistemic norms matter because adhering to them leads to positive epistemic outcomes, like true beliefs, accurate credences, or whatever you think is epistemically valid. And then, as Brian points out, if you accept a kind of consequentialist vindication, you're going to want to go in for trade-offs. Maybe you're going to want to go in for a kind of satisficing rather than maximizing kind of view. And so that pushes us towards non-standard epistemic norms. Another kind of vindication you might have is the respect-based vindications. So you could think of those as analogous to deontological approaches in ethics. And according to the respect-based vindication, epistemic norms matter because adhering to them demonstrates respect for true beliefs or other epistemic goods. I'm just going to probably use true beliefs a lot here as a stand-in for epistemic goods. And there's kind of 2 steps that Brian gives us for thinking about that. So step 1 on the respect-based vindication is that if we think about mundane and pointless beliefs, those are not going to have much importance at all. So respecting them is kind of we're not going to get much out of the vindication of respect on that front. And the second step is that for the other beliefs, and I mean, I think this works for all beliefs, respecting is going to enable trade-offs, according to Brian. And so he's thinking this is particularly salient when you've got cases of significantly different amounts of final value that are in play. So the basic idea that goes here, and I'll give you some examples in a second, but the basic idea here is that if you're in a case where you're refusing to make a trade-off when there's one thing that has a huge amount of value and another thing that has a little bit amount of value, the basic idea here is that refusing to make that trade-off would actually disrespect the more valuable thing. So there's 3 examples that Brian tells us about. So first, kind of simplest example is that, we've got a butterfly and a human, and maybe you have to injure the butterfly to save the human. Is that the right thing to do? And I think Brian's thought here is, if you don't, you're disrespecting the human by not harming the butterfly. So the thought here is, even on these respect-based accounts, you can have these trade-offs. Another case that was already brought up is the case where you have to ingest a pill. Well, I guess this case is a little bit different than the one that was brought up, but similar idea. Case where you have to ingest a pill, and that'll give you an epistemically bad belief. But the upside is that you save someone from death. And that, again, seems like a case where you'll take that trade-off. That seems like the right thing to do, and you'll do it out of respect for the person who you're trying to save. And then the third kind of point here, this isn't exactly an example, but a third point that Brian points to here is that in ethics, ethicists get a lot of purchase out of this idea that aggregating people doesn't really get you much. It's like, if you're aggregating people, like you still owe respect to each individual person. But that is disanalogous about what's going on in epistemology. In epistemology, putting together a bunch of beliefs can often have way more value than just like the sum of their values, because they give you like a view of the world, or a world, like more like a worldview kind of thing. And so that can give us some additional reasons to think that we should take the trade-offs in the respect kind of vindication cases in epistemology, even if we're not inclined to take them in the ethics side. All right, so then on the so then we had the consequentialist vindication. We should take trade-offs there. We have the respect-based vindication. We should take trade-offs there. Third vindication is the action-based vindication, and there the idea is that adhering to the epistemic norms enhances our ability to act more effectively. And in the book, Brian goes into 2 different ways you can instantiate this view, and they are importantly different. But the upshot is that if you want to do better action, or if you want your actions to have better status, which is the other view, either way, you're also going to get trade-offs because betterness of the okay. And then the final vindication is a kind of socially based vindication. And on this vindication, epistemic norms matter because they facilitate beneficial social interactions. And then so maybe here you can think about this in terms of like it benefits social interactions in terms of how we evaluate each other as sources of information or something like that. So like Sandy Goldberg has a picture like this. And then as Brian points out here too, you're going to get trade-offs again, because trade-offs will sometimes promote better social outcomes, even if you limit it to the kind of epistemic social outcomes. All right, so then that's how Brian's argument works, is we get these kind of non-standard norms if we look at what matters on each one of these vindications. So I have a concern about this, and it's kind of a big level concern about the whole methodology through the whole project. And I'm excited for Brian to tell me why this is misplaced in a minute. But the concern goes like this, that this methodology of looking at a vindication, then asking about what really matters on that vindication, and then saying, how do we get more of that? That way of thinking is a distinctly consequentialist kind of way of thinking. So my worry is that Brian is importing a kind of consequentialist thinking by using this methodology. And just to make the point clear, it's well known that consequentialism is going to give you trade-offs, and it's not going to vindicate standard epistemic norms. Although I know Jeff has written that there's ways of doing a kind of consequentialist picture without getting the trade-offs, but I think it'll give you the trade-offs. So then the worry here is that by doing this methodology, Brian is sort of importing a kind of consequentialist thinking. So here's a preview of a couple of examples of quotes from the book that make me think that. But I'll spell it out a bit more in a second. So on page 32, Brian says, epistemic norms should matter. And then he says, if epistemic norms systematically mattered less than competing norms, then we should systematically violate the epistemic norms and conform to the competing ones. So there it's about the norms mattering less. Another page, I don't have the page here, but you can probably Control F in your version, dear watcher. So he says, to argue for this, the claim he's making this part, I'm going to consider a series of different explanations for why the epistemic norms matter, and for each I'll show that some non-standard norms matter more according to it. So that's just what I was saying earlier, that it seems like a key idea to this methodology, that it's not just about mattering, it's about mattering more. Okay, so that's the big level idea. Let me try to, it's a commenting situation, so I'm going to try to make it a little bit sharper and aggressive, because that's how we make progress. But anyways, okay, so let's dig in on this a little bit, and let's focus particularly on Brian's respect-based vindication of the norms, because that should be the place where we should be the most surprised to see kind of consequentialist thinking come out. For the social ones and the action-based ones, there it's kind of not surprising. We're trying to get some goods, so trade-offs. But the respect-based, it's not, we're respecting the goods, we're not trying to get them in the same kind of way that consequentialism would. So that seems to be the place where this argument should be most surprising. And so Brian acknowledges that respecting a value and maximizing the value are distinct concepts, but in his discussion of the respect-based vindication and the other ones, Brian seems to repeatedly assume that respecting a value entails something like maximizing the value or promoting the value or getting more to some extent of the value. And yeah, okay, so here's some quotes to sort of indicate that from the respect-based section. On 128, Brian says, if beliefs have different levels of final importance, then not all beliefs are really beyond all price or admit of no replacement. Some beliefs have to be treated as having a price and as somewhat replaceable. The norms must see it as acceptable to harm some beliefs in order to benefit beliefs of greater importance. On 135, similar idea. Since aggregated beliefs do matter, then we sometimes ought to do great harm to one belief, even a very interesting one, in order to benefit some significantly large set of other beliefs. On 130, kind of a longer quote, sorry to read the book at you, but he says, an alternative and much more mainstream approach to respect and ethics says that it's permissible to step on the toe to save a life, and in fact, it is required. But it's because the failure to do so disrespects the person we could have saved, and stepping on the toe does not disrespect the person whose toe is stepped on. And then he says, on the latter view, humans are not beyond all price and irreplaceable. Rather, they merely have great final importance. If humans have great final importance, but not final importance beyond all price, then there's some good done to one person that can outweigh the combination of harm done to the other, and the final value of that other. And so the idea here sounds to me very kind of consequentialisty. In fact, each one of these quotes sounds like a way of rejecting the respect-based approaches and going in for more of a value. Doesn't have to be maximizing, but really caring about getting more of the value in certain kind of ways approach. Okay, so then my worry here is that Brian is just sneaking in a kind of consequentialism to the respect-based views and the other views, rather than getting it out of the vindications as he claims to be doing. All right, so just to make sure I'm really clear here. So I don't think the worry isn't this. The worry isn't that Brian doesn't say we can have a respect-based vindication of norms. So like two natural possibilities, if you want to think down that road, are things like you could have a vindication of norms that says things like it's like the intention behind the belief that really matters, rather than like the outcomes or something, like rather than epistemic value. So it might say something like you should focus on the manner in which one forms or maintains their beliefs. Deontological approaches in ethics say things like that. Or we could kind of go in for another kind of deontological approach that sets up guardrails and says these can never be crossed, and trade-offs would be on the other side of the guardrails. And the objection is not that Brian doesn't consider ideas like this, because he does. The objection here is really just that the methodology he uses, which is asking about what matters in those situations and saying, okay, well, this matters more. That methodology seems to be sneaking in a caring about the value kind of thing in a way that these views, I suspect, would not independently care about the value. All right, so that's kind of a big concern. They get smaller, in case you don't want to hear me keep talking too much. Okay, so the second concern, and I think Jeff is gonna pursue this a similar angle on this as well, is that in the section on consequentialism of the book, and also at the end of the book, Brian, and I think a few places throughout, if I remember correctly, Brian says that if we're going to be consequentialists, we should be satisficing consequentialists rather than maximizing consequentialists. And I think there's kind of three main steps in this argument. So I'm going to just lay those out for you so that we can all follow along. So the first step in the argument is a claim we could call something like consequentialist vindications are comparative. And that claim says to determine whether or how much a particular epistemic norm matters, consequentialists should compare the consequences of conforming to that norm with the consequences of conforming to alternative norms. So if we want to decide how much something matters, we ask if people follow this one, how much value would we get, versus if people followed this one, how much value would we get? All right, the second step is that maximizing consequentialism seems to focus on insignificant differences. So then Brian gives us a bunch of cases where there's a best option, and then there's a clearly worst option, and then there's an option that's not quite best, but it's nowhere near the worst. And in cases, so the important thing to notice about cases like that is that maximizing consequentialism will say you have to go for the very best option, whereas satisficing consequentialism will say either the two best options are fine, you can't go for the really bad thing. And then the last step in the argument seems to be a claim like this: because maximizing consequentialism focuses on insignificant differences, that is, distinguishing that very best option from the second best option, that satisficing consequentialism is going to better reflect what matters. Because the thought here is that by allowing for some degree of suboptimality, satisficing consequentialism will make sure we don't accidentally, not accidentally, but it points out really we should not be doing that bad thing. And that's what's most important in this situation. Whereas maximizing consequentialism is really concerned with like, well, the slightly suboptimal thing and the bad thing, those are really bad, don't do that. And you must do this best thing. So I think the idea here is that satisficing consequentialism seems to track what matters better than maximizing consequentialism. So here's a quote to support that. It's from 53. So Brian says, maximizing norms differentiate only between the best option and the other two by saying that the best option is permissible and the other two are forbidden. By grouping the suboptimal and worst options together, maximizing norms track similarities and differences that matter relatively little. Satisficing vindications, on the other hand, can give us norms that focus on the differences that matter more. Satisficing consequentialism can group the best and suboptimal options together, saying either is permissible, and differentiate them in the worst option by saying the worst is forbidden. All right, so I take it that that's the picture for thinking, or that's the reasons that Brian gives us for thinking that that satisficing consequentialism is the way to go if we're going to go in for a consequentialism. And my worry here is that I worry that Brian has given up, when he gives this argument, has given up on the main mantra of the book, which is focus on what matters. And I worry he's equivocating between two things. So the argument he gives us, I claim, seems to focus on whether or not the norms track similarities and differences that matter, rather than tracking what matters. And I think those are two importantly different things. So we can see that difference in exactly the cases that Brian points to, where we've got like a best, slightly sub-best, and worst. So maximizing norms in those cases will always track what matters best. But what I mean by track what matters is they'll tell us which thing is best, right? That's by definition, that's just not a substantive point, it's just a trivial point about maximizing. What Brian seems to point to is that maximizing norms, unlike satisficing norms, won't track that there's a huge gap between the suboptimal thing and the really worst thing. So according to maximizing norms, we should do this thing and everything else sucks. According to satisficing norms, we can do either one of these top two things. And the thought here is we can do either one of those because there's this huge gap to the next thing. And that's what's real. That's where the difference really matters. And so my worry here is that is right, that satisficing norms tell us more about the structure of the value in play, the structure of the options, but they don't do better at actually tracking what matters. So one way to put this point more directly is that I had this first step in the argument, the way I reconstructed Brian's argument, that was called consequentialist vindications are comparative. And that's the claim that said, to determine whether or how much a particular epistemic norm matters, consequentialists must compare the consequences of conforming to that norm with the consequences of conforming to the alternative norms. And so I think we should worry about this claim for more than one reason, but I think Talbot or Brian, I think, I don't know, Professor Talbot, anyways. So I think the professor makes a mistake in applying this claim. So when he compares the maximizing and satisficing norms, Brian doesn't compare the effects of conforming with the different norms to each other. What he seems to have compared intuitively is the effects of failing to comply with the norms to each other. So as Brian rightly points out, we should be much more worried about someone not complying with the satisficing norms than we should be about someone not complying with the maximizing norms. But it doesn't follow that success in complying with the maximizing norms is more important. Complying with the maximizing norms will always track what matters more, or at least as well, as satisficing norms. And since what we care about is what matters, according to Brian, that's what we should really care about, is the maximizing norms. All right, so that's a smaller concern. Paul, do I have 3 minutes? I think I've been talking for a while, but do I have 3 minutes to say one more thing? Great. Okay, so last thought here, and this is just genuinely not a concern, but it's a kind of interesting thing that I would love to hear Brian's thoughts on. So in the last chapter of the book, Brian gives us a picture of what the non-epistemic norms are supposed to look like. And I think there's 3 kind of key properties of those features that we should take away. So one is that the norms are respect-based, not consequentialist. So Brian tells us that the norms are to be understood in terms of being grounded in respect-based account of value, similar to deontological theories and ethics. And that means that the epistemic norms are fundamentally going to tell us how to appropriately respect epistemic goods rather than simply how to maximize them. A second distinctive claim about the non-standard norms is a non-surprising one, is that they're going to permit trade-offs. And then a third one, which we just kind of talked about, is that the norms are going to be laxer than standard epistemic norms, especially in the case of mundane and pointless beliefs. So Brian argues that the standard epistemic norms are too demanding, especially when applied to those beliefs that either have practically insignificant or no practical value at all beliefs. So those are the mundane and pointless beliefs. And so his non-standard norms would allow for greater flexibility in how we form and maintain those beliefs. All right. So those are 3 distinctive features. What I would like to focus on, though, on this account of what the epistemic norms are, is how Brian wants to distinguish epistemic norms from other kinds of norms. So what Brian tells us about that is, he says, if we're interested in what matters, then we should categorize norms into types based on the explanation for why they matter. So that's on page 229. And so if we're going to categorize norms into types based on the explanation for why they matter, it seems to follow that Brian thinks we should see the epistemic norms as those norms that are grounded in epistemic value, grounded in respecting epistemic value, but they're grounded in epistemic value as opposed to practical, moral, aesthetic, legal, whatever other kind of value you think there is. Okay, so another way to think about this is you could say on Brian's account, presumably the epistemic norms are going to be the ones that are concerned with what makes beliefs good or bad as beliefs, or whatever it doesn't have to be beliefs if you think other things epistemically matter, independently of their practical or other considerations. So then, assuming that's right, my question is whether or not this means that epistemic norms on this non-standard picture can also apply to non-beliefs. So the kind of standard view is that epistemic norms apply to beliefs. They, evaluate beliefs as justified, rational, right, whatever you want to say. But it seems to me like we often do things, so we perform actions that also respect things that are finally epistemically valuable. So one example of something we do to respect things that are finally epistemic valuable is have conversations like this, if you'd like a meta kind of example. Another thing we do, if you need a more tangible example, is like, okay, you have some data and you're trying to figure out what to do with it, and it's statistically complex. So maybe you'll download a book on advanced statistical methods in order to make sure that you're doing the right kind of statistical test or something like that. So downloading a book seems like something we would do in that case because it respects what's finally epistemically valuable, that is getting the right view about this interesting question or something like that. So it seems to follow, I think, on Brian's view that these non-epistemic norms should apply to actions. So my question is whether or not that's right. If it's not right, why is it not right? And just to be clear, Brian, I suspect you know this, but I love that conclusion. I do think that epistemic norms apply to action. So it's really not an objection. It's really what do you think kind of question. So yeah, so thanks again for setting this up, Paul. This is a really great discussion so far, and I'm sure it will be forward. And thanks, Brian, for giving us the content to discuss here. It's really interesting.
Wonderful. Jeff, could you give your comments now as well?
Sure, absolutely. And I'm going to share my screen just for part of my comments. That's going to hopefully make it easier. And then not share it for the rest. Can you see that okay? It should just be white, but it will have something on it later. Okay. Excellent. Well, thanks first to Brian for a really creative, well-argued book. I really enjoyed reading it, kind of echoing both the other commentators and considering the arguments. Given Dan's recent arguments, maybe this comment will make sense. As someone sympathetic to broadly consequentialist approaches in epistemology, I may be a more sympathetic reader than most and found myself nodding along a lot, maybe nodding along too much if Dan's right. This is called Philosopher Meets Critics, so I can't just nod along today. So I'm going to try to be somewhat critical here. In particular, I'll raise three considerations that are maybe objections, maybe just opportunities to comment more. And I'm going to kind of go in the opposite direction that Dan did. I'm going to start with some nitty-gritty objections, kind of in the weeds, and then finish with maybe a bigger picture sort of question or concern. So that's the plan. So the first, get this here. So the first objection or first point, I guess, is about this satisficing versus maximizing kind of argument that Dan helpfully summarized there. And the way I see this is it's another instance of arguing that if you're taking a consequentialist approach, you're going to be committed to non-standard norms, the non-standard norm being the satisficing norm rather than the maximizing norm. Maybe that's not quite the way to think about it, but okay, so here's how I take the argument. We're given these kind of cases, the kind of case that Dan just talked about, where we have an option set like this, where we've got a best option, a suboptimal but still pretty good option, and a worst option. And if the satisficing threshold is, say, there just after suboptimal, then the maximizing norm says that you have to do best, whereas the satisficing norm says that you can do best or suboptimal. And Brian writes on page 54, in these cases, conforming with norms that require maximizing rather than norms that require satisficing matters much less than conforming with norms that require satisficing rather than norms that fall short of satisficing. Why is this? And I think, again, Dan's already sort of talked about this, but the basic idea is that the difference between satisficing and not satisficing is very large, whereas the difference between maximizing and not maximizing could be large, but it need not be. It could just be that little tiny difference between best and suboptimal. So just to put some meat on the bones here, the case that Brian gives is not an epistemic case, but it helps you think about this a little bit. Suppose the best is saving the drowning child while you're smiling. The suboptimal is saving the drowning child while you're frowning. And that the worst is don't save the child. It seems like it's clearly most important to save the child. So maybe following the satisficing norm is most important here rather than following the maximizing norm. Okay, so far just presenting the argument. There's another kind of case you might give where it's just best and suboptimal. There's no worst option. And so the threshold's here. So what do we say about this kind of case? According to Brian, He says, in these cases, conformity with the maximizing norms matters more than conformity with the satisficing norms, but just a bit more, since conformity with the maximizing norms only makes things a bit better. I trust that view sort of makes sense what he's saying there. And so then this is kind of oversimplifying a bit, but the argument as I take it, I might be wrong here, is something like, in case one, that first case I gave you, conforming to satisficing norms matters a lot more than conforming to maximizing norms. I grant that. In case two, conforming to maximizing norms matters a little more than conforming to satisficing norms. And this is, I did not try to make this valid, so just trying to get the basic idea out there. Hence, satisficing norms are better with regards to what matters, and intuitively, because when satisficing norms are better, they're a lot better, and when they're worse, they're only a little worse. Something like that is how I'm understanding the argument. Okay, so what I want to think about is a different kind of objection to this than the one that Dan raised, but rather is to think about cases like this, where we've got like a smooth option set. So there's no big gaps. So you've got best, suboptimal 1, suboptimal 2, et cetera, bad, worst, kind of like what's on the screen. So here's where I'm a little confused. It seems like to me that, suppose the satisficing threshold is there. The difference between satisficing and not satisficing in a case like this sometimes really matters, like when we're going from suboptimal 1 to worst, but sometimes it doesn't matter much if we're going from suboptimal 1 to suboptimal 2. And similarly, it looks like the difference between maximizing and not maximizing sometimes really matters when we go from best to worst, or maybe best to bad, but sometimes it really doesn't matter when we, or it doesn't matter as much when we go from best to suboptimal 1. And so I don't really see a clear advantage for satisficing norms over maximizing norms in this kind of a case. And to my mind, this might be important because I suspect, or I hypothesize, that a lot of the epistemic cases are going to be these smoother cases like this, where there aren't these big gaps between the sort of the best and the suboptimal and the worst. And one way to think about this is just to think about, if you're thinking in terms of credence, for any proposition, the options you have are anywhere from credence 1 to credence 0. And it looks like this is, in some way of thinking about it, a pretty smooth option set here. And so I wonder whether, if most of the cases are cases like this is what I'm calling a different case, whether that upsets the argument for satisficing over maximizing. So again, I actually spent a long time thinking about this argument, like more than I should admit to, and it kept me up like at night. And I don't know why. I just was really... So I might be misunderstanding this argument. And so another way to think of this comment is not as an objection, but just an invitation to sort of clarify the argumentative structure here, which I might be missing. Okay, that's the first comment. Second comment takes us to a different chapter, chapter 5, which is about epistemic norms and action. And in particular, I want to think about knowledge and action. And the way to think about this is that I'm going to try to give a case where it seems like knowledge makes an action better. And since knowledge norms are sort of these standard norms, this would be a reason to think that there's a reason to hang on to some of these standard norms. I should say I'm not saying this is necessarily my view, but I'm kind of curious what Brian might say about this. So here's the idea I want to work with. The idea that blame or punishment, those kind of actions, are only appropriate if I know that you did wrong. So suppose Jenny stole the cookies. If I know that she did, then I can punish Jenny for doing so. If I just luckily guess that she did, it seems like I can't punish her appropriately for stealing the cookies. So here's a case where it looks like punishing an action is better when based on knowledge. And so in chapter 5, Brian gives a set of cases, again, involving drowning children, interestingly enough, for arguing that knowledge is not required for actions to have this kind of better status. He doesn't give a blame and punishment case, a different kind of case. The case he gives is a case where you imagine a child, Jenny, who's drowning in a pond, and Fred is going to save her. And we imagine a case where Fred saves her because he knows she's drowning, and a case where Fred saves her because he thinks it's a toy and he jumps in to get the toy. And I think most people in that case think that Fred's action based on knowledge in that case is better than Fred's action based on the mistaken belief that it was a toy. But there's these other non-knowledge cases where Fred's action of saving Jenny rather, still are worthy of sort of respect or commendation. So the case is like this: the knowledge case. There's a child, Jenny, drowning in a pond. Fred knows it's Jenny drowning and fishes her out. He thereby rescues Jenny. That seems like good job, Fred. But here's a non-knowledge case. Brian calls this not quite. There's a child, Jenny, drowning in a pond. Fred believes that it's a different child, Sally, who's drowning and fishes her out. He thereby rescues Jenny. Seems like here we'd still say good job, Fred, differently than when he thinks he's saving a toy. And so it looks like maybe the commendation for Fred's action here doesn't require knowledge. It requires something else, less than knowledge. So I was interested by this, and I wanted to think about if we could get these kind of cases with the blame or punishment cases that I was interested in. And so I decided to try to do this, and the first attempt doesn't work, I think, but is instructive maybe. So I thought, well, maybe we could do this. Here's a knowledge case of the cookie thief. Jenny stole the cookies. Fred knows that Jenny stole the cookies, and on that basis takes away her TV privileges for a day. So that seems okay. If you think that's a proportional punishment, right? Put that aside. Here's not quite. Jenny stole the cookies. Fred believes that a different child, Sally, stole the cookies, and on this basis takes away Jenny's TV privileges for a day. That clearly doesn't work. That's not okay in that version. But I think there's a way we can rework the case, and it's actually something Brian says in that chapter helped me think about this. In the drowning child case, what he says is that what's really important is that the agent who's acting, Fred in this case, is sufficiently connected to what matters about the situation. And so in the drowning case, we might think what matters is that a child's drowning, not really whether it's Jenny or Sally. And in the punishment case, what we might say is that what matters most about the situation is who stole the cookies. So when we change who it is in the punishment case, that's not tracking what matters in the case. So in light of that, we might try to rework this case like this. So knowledge double star. This is the case where Jenny stole 17 cookies. Fred knows that Jenny stole 17 cookies, and on this basis takes away her TV privileges for a day. And then not quite double star. Jenny stole 17 cookies. Fred believes that Jenny stole 18 cookies, and on this basis takes away Jenny's TV privileges for a day. And here you might think it's still okay for Fred to give this punishment in the not quite double star case here, because he's tracking what matters about the case, that Jenny stole some cookies, right? Now, but of course, just to be clear, in not quite double star, Fred doesn't have knowledge, right? Because Fred believes she stole 18 cookies and she didn't. That's false. So he's punishing her based on something that's not knowledge, right? Now, there's a standard move here you might make if you think knowledge is required, and Brian talks about this in the book, which is that, well, even though one of Fred's beliefs is false, he believes that Jenny stole 18 cookies and she stole 17, this other nearby belief is true. He believes she stole some cookies. That's knowledge, and so that's what he's acting on in the knowledge that's required for punishing Jenny in this case. So here's what Brian says in response to a similar kind of move in the drowning child case. He considers a perhaps psychologically impossible case where Fred believes that Sally is drowning, but does not have the more general belief that a child is drowning. So it would be this kind of like, we don't suppose there's not that belief there. And in this case, Brian says, Fred is still acting based on the morally relevant features of the case, even though he has no knowledge of those features. The false thing he believes, that Jenny is drowning when it's Sally, still puts him in touch with the objective reasons for action to the same extent as in the good case, right? So going back to this case, and I hope it's not too confusing jumping between cookies and drowning children, I think I don't quite buy that in this case. So just to see what that would be in this case, Brian might say that in not quite double star, even if Fred doesn't have the more general belief that Jenny stole cookies, he can still act on the basis of the morally relevant features of the case, and so appropriately punish her. But here's where I object. So I think if Fred doesn't believe that Jenny stole cookies, but does believe that she stole 18 cookies, I don't see how he's in touch with the morally relevant features of the case. And so here's how I was thinking. What are the morally relevant features of the case? Well, option one, you might say the morally relevant feature of the case is that Jenny stole cookies. But the problem here is that Fred isn't acting on this since he doesn't believe it's true, right? He doesn't have this belief. Option 2, you might say the morally relevant feature of the case is that Genae stole 17 cookies. The problem here is that Fred isn't acting on this because he doesn't believe 17 cookies were stolen. And so I'm not sure when we don't grant Fred that general belief about some cookies being stolen, he is, or I don't see how he could be acting on the morally relevant features of the case. So just a kind of analogy, imagine you have a computer or an AI system that doesn't represent color. Can it act based on the fact that a stop sign is red? It seems not, and so I don't see how Fred could be acting on the morally relevant features of a case in a case like this. So I guess really to sum up this comment, I'm just curious to hear more about how Brian's understanding the way that in which false beliefs can connect us to reasons for actions in cases like these blame and punishment cases or the drowning child kind of case. Okay. We okay on time? Okay. So my third point is about a more general point about this notion that comes up over and over in the book, and we've talked about a lot now, about this idea that norms that matter more than others, or conforming with one norm mattering more than conforming with another norm. And I'm going to stop sharing here because I have no interesting slides. I just wanted to put up that title. So this is a more general comment. And so frequently we're told in the book that conforming with certain kinds of norms matters more or less than conforming with certain other norms. And I guess the worry I have, I don't know if worry is the right word, but a question I have is that this comparison, this idea that we should compare conforming with norms for how much they matter, is initially brought up, and I think in a familiar way, by comparing norms in two different classes. So like we might compare the norms of etiquette with the norms of morality, or the norms of chutes and ladders with the norms of etiquette, right? And I think that's a familiar kind of thought that these norms might matter, these kinds of norms might matter more or less than others in these different cases. But after introducing the idea this way, we're asked, I think, to consider whether two norms within the same class, or that are norms, as Brian would say, I think, for the same reason, matter more or less than each other. And it's not clear to me that that's the right way to think, or that concept makes sense when we're talking about norms in the same class. I grant that two different norms in the same class could be better or worse than each other in some way, but I don't know that the mattering more or less locution makes sense there. Sorry, just lost my place here. So I think, one way to put it is that, think about norms of etiquette versus norms of morality. We could say that one matters more or less. In the restrict our attention just to norms of etiquette now, I think there's some way in which we could say certain norms of etiquette matter more than each other. So you might say putting your napkin on your lap matters more than eating your salad with the right fork or something like that. But the kind of comparisons we're getting in the book are more like two different norms about how to put your napkin in your lap, and saying one of those matters more or less than the other is the way I'm understanding it. And I'm not sure that I understand how to evaluate mattering more or less when the reasons are the same, and we're talking about they're competing norms in some sense, rather than norms about different sorts of behaviors or norms about different sorts of classes. So that's not super well formed, and this morning I was thinking more about this and have other thoughts that maybe confuse what I'm saying here, but maybe just an invitation to say more about whether you think the comparison of norms across classes or across reason types makes sense when you're within a single class or a single reason type. So I'll conclude there. Thanks again very much, both to the other commentators who I learned a lot from, and from the book, of course.
Brian, it's to you.
Sorry, I just had a thought that I want to write down before I go on. So sorry, give me 30 seconds to finish writing this note. All right. That's a thought I'm not going to talk about in these comments, but it's a thought I want to think about some more going forward. So there's a lot going on in these comments, and some of it is it gets in very technical directions. And I really would love to just talk for a couple hours about how I think about consequentialism. But unfortunately, I was told I wasn't allowed to do that. So I'm going to try to focus and address as much of that as I can as succinctly as possible. There's going to be a little bit of oversimplification and corner cutting here and there. But hopefully I can give the people watching this who haven't read the book yet, or I mean, hopefully everybody's read the book in the world, but I imagine there's a couple of people who haven't, a flavor of what's going on. So I'm going to start my slideshow and then screen share. Okay. So I'm going to do it in sort of a weird order, just because it's the order that makes the most sense to me. So the first thing I want to talk about is, I believe, basically, am I just building consequentialism in sort of, that slide should just, there we go. Am I just sort of assuming consequentialism? And I want to be really clear, and this did come up in the comments, I myself am not endorsing I don't think of myself as a consequentialist. I mean, my own view is sort of this complicated hybrid of partly deontological vindication and partly consequentialist, but I don't think of myself as a pure consequentialist, so I really don't want to be assuming consequentialism or building in consequentialism into my arguments, but you might think I am because, kind of to summarize, I'm assuming that we ought to follow norms that matter more, and I'm arguing for trade-offs, and these look like very consequentialist ways of thinking, and they do look like very consequentialist ways of thinking, but they also look, I'm about to argue, also exactly like non-consequentialist ways of thinking. So while most of my research is in epistemology and a little bit in ethics, my teaching is pretty significantly split between ethics and epistemology, and mostly ethics and political philosophy, if I'm perfectly honest. And so I think a lot about ethics and I do a lot of reading and researching ethics. And so let's talk a little bit about deontological ethics. So here is effectively a truism in mainstream deontological ethics, which is deontological ethical norms come into conflict. And we also have duties of beneficence and duties to prevent harm. And so, we're going to have obligations to help other people and to prevent harm to other people. And of course, these are going to enter into conflicts with our other normative duties, other ethical duties. And when these norms conflict, there's at least sometimes a thing to do. I say sometimes there might be these sort of tragic dilemmas where ethics has literally nothing to say, but those cases are not at least all the cases. What we should do in these cases like conflict is determined by the weight of the relevant reasons or by the strength of the relevant duties, kind of depending on who you ask. But crucially, moreness does a lot of work here, right? You go for the weightier reasons or the stronger duties. This is the mainstream kind of way of thinking about deontological ethics. There are some people in deontological ethics who don't have this kind of view, but they tend to be very niche areas, and it's definitely not the mainstream view. Even people who think of themselves as Kantians want, in many cases, to try to rehabilitate Kant to show how you can think of even Kantian views as kind of somewhat along these lines. So kind of it's a commonplace if we think about respect. Norms is fundamentally about respect, that sometimes we ought to violate one norm or one prima facie duty or one pro tanto duty in order to satisfy, roughly speaking, the more important one. The more important duty, where more important is in terms of weight of reasons or strength of duties. And this kind of metaphor about weighing is just sort of, sort of the default metaphor in this literature, right? So this is a very respect-based way of thinking. Requires us, again, in the spirit of mainstream deontological non-consequentialist ethics, to think along these lines where moreness is doing a bunch of work. It's just not good promotion moreness, but it can look like it. So, we can benefit other people, and sometimes the importance of benefiting other people is enough to justify violating a less important duty, and sometimes the importance of preventing harm to other people can justify violating some less important duty. And so if we think about respect in the epistemic context, respect for what epistemically matters, respect for the epistemic good can say benefiting some beliefs that we have and making those beliefs better, or some understanding that we have, or whatever the epistemic good is, helping these doxaxial states we're currently in, can be required by something like an epistemic duty of beneficence, and sometimes that's so important that it can outweigh weaker epistemic duties. And similarly, we might realize that some of our beliefs are actually false, and so they're being harmed in a sense, kind of metaphorically. And so to prevent that harm, that might be so important from the standpoint of respect that it outweighs a lesser duty to not harm some other beliefs. And so we're going to get trade-offs, and based on something like moreness or more weight or more strength, in a way that's in no way consequentialist. And so you might still ask, well, fair enough, you can think about deontology on that ways, but maybe we can give a plausible absolutist or Kantian account of epistemic norms. So you might think you don't have to be this kind of weighing deontologist as basically almost everybody is in ethics, or everybody in mainstream deontological ethics. Maybe we can give a more Kantian absolutist account of epistemic norms that say they either never come into conflict, or when they do, there's just nothing to say about those conflicts. They're never overridden or anything like that. But again, we wouldn't accept, and we definitely shouldn't accept such an account of non-epistemic norms, right? This is part of why the sort of, there's a problem for this very, very traditional Kantian account, which is like, you can't lie to the murderer at the door, even to save your friend's life. There's no trade-offs whatsoever. That kind of very strict, very absolutist thing, it's just be, really bizarre and implausible outside of epistemology. If you want to vindicate some norms in the epistemic domain, you really have this really heavy burden of proof where you have to explain, why would norms like that matter? What about the epistemic realm could explain why norms like that matter? And as I try to argue in the chapter on respect-based vindications, they're just, you can't get that off the ground. So I think, I'm trying really to not be a consequentialist in that chapter, because I'm not a consequentialist in ethics, and I think you can import those ideas into epistemology. And so I'm trying to kind of be in the spirit of really mainstream thinking about what respect looks like. So that's the first response, that I don't think I'm just importing in consequentialist thinking, because non-consequentialist thinking does, outside of epistemology, does think about moreness in some sense or another. It's just a different kind of sense, and how it is different is very subtle. And that's the thing I can't get into right here, but I do discuss in the book. So that's the first set of things. The next thing I want to discuss is, and this is the comments on satisficing, which is why I wanted to address sort of both Professor Dunn and Professor Singer at the same time, because you can both push on what I say about satisficing. So kind of how this works and why satisficing norms matter. And I'm glad this kept you up, by the way, trying to think about this, because this is the hardest part of the entire book for me to write. I think consequentialism is very hard to think about in a lot of interesting ways, and I have a lot of sympathy towards kind of consequentialist thinking. I've thought a lot about it over the years, in and out of epistemology and ethics, and so this is very hard to kind of put this into words. So I should say, again, to really be clear, I am not myself a fully committed consequentialist. I do think there's room for consequentialist vindications in epistemology, and probably some of the epistemic norms are going to get a consequentialist vindication to some extent. And actually, a lot of the respect-based norms are in complicated ways going to look kind of quasi-consequentialist if we think stuff like understanding matters and stuff like that. I discuss that in the book. But in the chapter on consequentialism, I say, let's just assume consequentialism is the right approach, and discuss what norm that's going to vindicate. But now I am not actually endorsing satisficing in that chapter. What that chapter is doing is arguing against maximizing approaches, because and once we reject maximizing approaches, you can't vindicate the standard norms. So in the chapter, I'm actually endorsing either satisficing or what's called a scalar kind of vindication, which I'll get to in a bit. So I do try to give an argument for satisficing, but my thought in the chapter is, if those arguments ultimately fail, what we get out of that is not maximizing, but rather scalar accounts, and those cannot vindicate standard epistemic norms for reasons I'll get to in a bit. But let's talk about why I think satisficing norms do matter more than maximizing in light of these kind of comments. It was the kind of pushback from the commentators. The kind of satisficing I endorse is a very specific form of satisficing for reasons I get into the chapter. But effectively, you look at all the goodness of all your options, you consider the worst option, and then your some epsilon value, and any option that's more than epsilon better than the worst option is permissible. In the chapter, I discuss how you might try to figure out what epsilon is and why that's the right form of satisficing. But so anything that's more than epsilon better than the worst is permissible, whereas the maximizer says you have to take the best option. So then we have this question, how much does it matter that we conform to the norms? And I want to argue that it matters more that we conform to the norms we get from satisficing than the ones we get from maximizing. But this question, how much does it matter, is actually not a fully formed question, because, as Professor Singer points out, I think this really has to be a comparative question. How much does it matter that we conform to the norms rather than that we do something else? And then the question is, what is that? What is the relevant comparison? Why do I think it has to be comparative? Well, I'll give you a kind of toy example. So let's say this is not an epistemic example, but let's say I give $1 to charity, and simultaneously you give $1 million to charity. And we say, oh, how much did my action matter? And I say, oh, it mattered $1,001 because after I acted, the charity had $1,001. So that's how much my action mattered. Well, that's not right. To figure out how much my action mattered, really what we have to do is say, we compare what happened if I acted versus what would have happened had I not acted, right? And that's, so the difference I made is $1. So we have to do these comparing acting and not acting, something like that. These are always contrasted notions for mattering. So the way the way I'm thinking about evaluating how much the maximizing and satisfying norms matter is this very complicated way that I don't always articulate perfectly well in the chapter, because it gets very tedious to try to say this in a way that makes it very tedious to try to read the chapter. But I was thinking, does it matter more? So we take the satisficing norms and we say, does it matter more to conform to them rather than violate them? That tells them how much they matter. And we take the maximizing norms and we say, how much does it matter to conform to them rather than violate them? And then we compare that. And that's how I was trying to think about it. It's very hard to articulate. And of course, the challenge is, and part of why I'm thinking about it that way is because, strictly speaking, satisficing and maximizing norms don't conflict with each other, because you can always conform to both maximizing and satisficing norms by maximizing. If you maximize, you're going to conform to satisficing norms as well. So you don't get these conflicts, and that's why I was thinking about conforming to rather than violating satisficing compared to conforming to rather than violating maximizing. That's kind of where I was coming from when I was thinking about this chapter. But of course, how do we answer this question? How do we figure out which matters more? Well, I think we need to think about the definition of mattering. So one of the characteristic features, well, it's not a definition, but it's a characteristic feature. One characteristic feature of mattering is the less a norm matters, the more we can shrug off gratuitous violations. So violating the norm for no reason, the more we want to say, so what, about these violations, the less the norm matters. And so we can use this as evidence about how much norms matter. And so then we have these cases that get talked about in the comments, where there's a best option, an almost as good option that's very close, and then a much worse option. And we say, okay, so the maximizing norm says I have to take the best option. Let's say I violate the maximizing norm by satisficing. And then, basically what I think is you kind of want to shrug that off and say, well, not that bad. It did pretty well. So, it's not nothing, but it's not that big of a deal. Whereas if I fail to satisfy, then that means I do the much worse thing, and that's much less shrug-offable. And so the thought is, if we think about sort of the characteristic features of mattering, that tells us as evidence that the maximizing norm matters less than the satisficing norm when we think about the comparison class being how much does it matter to conform rather than violating each type of norm. I should say that I would be thrilled if there was a spirited discussion in the literature on epistemic consequentialism about how to evaluate how much norms matter, because I think that's a really interesting question. It's really challenging, and I really wrestled with this in the book, and this is what I came up with. And I think there's some interesting. I suspect I'd be shocked if there's not a lot of interesting room for discussion in kind of alternate ways. This is kind of how I was thinking about it in the book, which I didn't. I know that I didn't always articulate as well as possible because it's really hard to put into words. But as I was thinking about these comments, I came up with another argument that this is not in the book. So another characteristic feature of mattering is when you get two norms that conflict, where you can only satisfy one of them or the other, but not both, you should follow the norm that matters more. So you can look at cases of conflict between norms, and if you know how to properly resolve the conflict, that tells you how much norms matter. Now in the book, this is hard to apply to maximizing the satisficing epistemic norms, since, as I just said, they don't conflict, right? Because you can always satisfy both by just maximizing. So wasn't sort of motivating my arguments in the book, but I was thinking about this more in response to these comments. And this also, by the way, is going to address one of the questions that Professor Dunn asked about comparisons within classes. So here's a kind of a weird test case. And it's very, very kind of sketchy and kind of abstract, but it kind of give you the flavor of what I was thinking. So again, you have these options. There's a best option, an almost as good epistemic option, and a very bad option. Now, again, we're not getting, the maximizing norm says do the best option. The satisficing norm says do the best or almost as good option. Again, they don't conflict with each other. So we can't directly use this truism about conflict, or this feature about conflict, to tell you which matters more. But what we can ask is, we can generate a conflict between each of them and some norm outside the epistemic domain. And that will give us some insight into how they matter relative to one another. So this is a very sketchy, underdeveloped case, but imagine, I say, hey, if you violate the maximizing norm, I'll give you $5. And imagine there's going to be some case in which, all right, I'll take the $5. So prudentially, you're obligated to take the $5, imagine. So we have this prudential norm telling you to take the $5. And you're like, you know what? I'm going to take the $5 because I can violate the maximizing norm and have an almost as, still a pretty good belief. Plus I get the $5. So yes, I'm violating the maximizing norm, but I should to get the $5, right? So you imagine some case in which the $5 prudential obligation is more important than maximizing. But we can imagine if I offered you instead the $5 and generate that prudential obligation to violate the satisficing epistemic norm, in some cases where it would make sense to violate the maximizing norm and form almost as good belief, it wouldn't make sense to violate the satisficing norm and form a very bad belief. It wouldn't be worth the $5 prudential obligation. So I think you can generate cases like this. If you can, what it shows is that the $5 prudential obligation matters more than the maximizing obligation, but less than the satisficing obligation. And so therefore, by transitivity, the satisficing obligation matters more than the maximizing obligation, even though and you can determine that by looking at conflicts outside of between epistemic norms and non-epistemic norms, and that will tell you about mattering within the epistemic domain, even if you can't generate conflicts within the epistemic domain. So that's a thought about why you might think satisficing epistemic norms matter in cases that at least have this kind of structure. And in the book, I try to argue that this is a structure that we might see very often in the epistemic domain. But I have worries about this, and I kind of try to confess to these worries in the chapter. There's some things that disturb me, and part of this is where Professor Dunn pushes back. What about cases in which we have a best option, an almost as good option, a slightly worse than that option, right? So we have this like more or less continuous space of options, right, that are all pretty close to each other in terms of value, right? So the satisficing norm says, hey, take the option that's epsilon. Any option that's epsilon more than the worst option, but like one way to think about this worry is, well, why epsilon? Why not epsilon -1 or epsilon -2 or epsilon +1? Why that cutoff and not some other cutoff? No cutoff really is going to look particularly important because there's always distinctly important, I should say, because you could have set the cutoff somewhere else, and it would have been, maybe seem in some sense just as important, because the difference between where you put the cutoff and where like something just above or below it is not that big of a deal. So why focus on epsilon as the satisficing norms do? In these cases where you have this sort of continuous option space, or a relatively continuous option space, a very fine-grained option space. And you should expect fine-grained option spaces quite often if you're interested in credences. But even if you're interested in beliefs, of course, belief is not fine-grained, but the content of belief can be fine-grained, right? So you can believe the truth, but you can also believe a falsehood that's very close to the truth, or a falsehood that's a little bit farther from the truth, or a falsehood a little bit farther from the truth. And so even for full belief, you can get these somewhat continuous option states in principle. So this is, I think, a really kind of a vexing problem if you're inclined towards satisficing. I should say it's not definitely a problem, because you might get a continuous option space, but discontinuity in value of your option space. And there you might still say, well, as long as the satisficing norms are sort of sensitive to the discontinuity. So for example, you get a space of options which are all close to each other in some sense, but there's a big jump in value, and there's some interesting jump in value along the continuum. And if that's the case, you might say, well, that it's important to be sensitive to that big jump in value, or that discontinuity in value. And so we might say the norms that matter would be sensitive to that. So what am I thinking about this? Well, for example, there might be a difference between good and bad credences. And this is actually a real vexing problem in formal epistemology, if you're interested in accuracy. So the literature on accuracy tends to see accuracy of credences as just in terms of betterness and worseness. But in economic terms, we just think of betterness and worseness, and there's no genuine goodness and badness in some sense. We can kind of do away with that notion. But you might think there's some credences, as your credences get less and less accurate, at some point you're like, it'd be better to have no credence than to have that level of inaccuracy. And so we go from they're okay but not so great, and then suddenly they go from it's barely a little bit good, and suddenly on the other side of that, the next credence down is like a bad credence. It'd be better to have no credence than that credence. And if you get those kind of discontinuities and credences, even though there's a sort of continuous range of options, there's not continuity in value. And so maybe you might be able to get some kind of argument for that being relevant to the threshold there. And you might get similarly for usefulness. So if you think about full beliefs in various degrees of falsehood as licensing certain bets, you might get a point where the bets you're licensed suddenly become way less valuable, or much more disvaluable. And so in principle, even if you get continuous space of options, you can get discontinuities in value. And so maybe you can argue for satisficing that a form of satisficing that's sensitive to that. That's an open possibility. But still, what if it turns out that there's a best option, and there's more or less continuity in value? And this is still going to be a problem for any kind of satisficing, because it's going to set what looks like basically an arbitrary threshold. Because it's going to focus on epsilon, but it could have focused on something close to epsilon. But of course, that's not going to say that maximizing is particularly good either, because focusing on the best is also arbitrary, because the second best is pretty close to as good, and so on and so forth. So in the book, this raises the worry, why does conforming to any norm matter significantly? Since all the kind of thresholds we might set for how the norms work are just like sensitive to like very fine-grained, unimportant degrees of value. And what this gives us is a view called scalar consequentialism. This is like most prominently advocated by Alistair Norcross. If you're at all interested in consequentialism, both in ethics or epistemology, you really need to read some of Alistair's work. It's really good. It's really powerful. And Alistair argues in ethics that we should just give up. If you're a consequentialist, you just give up on deontic notions. And similarly, I think if you're not convinced of satisficing in epistemology, you need to go for a scalar view, not a maximizing view. And the scalar consequentialism effectively says you can't vindicate any deontic norms. So any kind of binary should, shouldn't, right, wrong, permissible, impermissible, justified, unjustified, rational, irrational notion, all those, none of those get vindicated. Only degreed notions, betterness and worseness, more or less favored by reasons, only those get vindications. And so if the arguments for satisficing fail, then what we get is not maximizing, but rather scalar consequentialism. And that's an even more radical upshot. And I think that's all the time I have left.
Ryan, thank you. Thank you for the book. I know writing a book is no small project. And thank you, commentators. Reading a book is no small project and giving really interesting comments. Yeah, so thank you again. We look forward to getting this out there very soon.